This is my yellow period. Don't get your hopes too high. It's not hepatitis, it's the lighting. Some would say that this is my orange period, and I am, if anything, politically adaptable. It pays to be orange nowadays. I'm going to discuss something that sounds political: regulation, or more precisely, self regulation. Now, focus on the phrase self regulation. First of all, it implies that there is a self and that this self uses or deploys some kind of regulatory authority, some kind of internal police, in order to stabilize processes such as affects, emotions, and or moods, and so on and so forth. It's a bit misleading, and that's the understatement, the Parisian understatement of the century. It's a bit misleading because it's debatable whether we have a self in the classical sense or whether it's a lot more fluid and in flux. And it's also debatable whether the regulatory environment, the regulation or the self-regulation of emotions, for example, has anything to do with a regulatory agency which is possessed of some kind of regulatory power, whether there is an internalized law book or criminal code that kinds of dictates how the regulation is done, and in which case the regulator intervenes and enforces the laws and regulations. That's not exactly how it works. Actually, it's not at all how it works. I'm here to lend you a hand and to help you to regulate yourselves, or at least to regulate your knowledge about regulation. My name is Sam Vaknin. I'm the author of Malignant Self-Love, Narcissism Revisited. I am also a professor of psychology, and right now I'm in the city of lights, at least yellow-orange lights. They're known as Paris, the capital of France. Oui, oui. Okay, Shoshanim et Shoshanot. Let's delve right into the topic. Self-regulation is about control. It's when you control not exactly internal processes, but when you control behavior. And how do you control your behavior? By monitoring yourself. Introspection, self-awareness, keeping records of your behavior, learned experience, lessons you have derived, inputs from the environment, inhibitory processes, disinhibition in some cases, if, for example, you've taken coke or drank alcohol, and so on and so forth. Control is a critical feature of self-regulation, but as opposed to what self-styled experts would tell you, self-regulation is not actually about internal processes, but has to do a lot with behavior. And it involves self-evaluation, assessing the information obtained during the aforementioned self-monitoring, or introspection, or self-supervision, or whatever you want to call it. So we have self-monitoring, followed by self-evaluation, assessment, and then self-reinforcement, rewarding yourself for appropriate behavior, for example, attaining a goal, and punishing yourself for inappropriate behavior, behavior that is proven to be self-defeating or self-destructive. So it's all about behavior. Self-regulation is all about behavior. And it's all about controlling the behavior, channeling the behavior, molding the behavior, making choices which are self-enhancing and helpful and goal-oriented, not self-defeating, not self-destructive, not self-trashing, not self-harming. And that's precisely why we say that in certain mental health disorders, such as borderline personality disorder, there's a massive problem with self-regulation, because people with borderline personality disorder are all the above: self-defeating, self-destructive, self-trashing, and self-harming. Self-regulatory processes are missing. Indeed, in behavior therapy, the emphasis is on self-regulatory processes. And as the name of the treatment modality implies, it's about behavior. So first, we got rid of the first myth that self-regulation is something internal that has to do with internal things, what's going on inside. Not at all. It has to do with the way you act and behave. And because many behaviors are relational, many behaviors are either triggered by the presence of other people, are directed at other people in order to modify their behaviors or obtain goals, and so on and so forth. You cannot divorce self-regulation from the social context or socio-psychological context. There's a lot of relationality in self-regulation. So the word self is very misleading. Perhaps we should have used the phrase self-other regulation or something, but to imply that it's about self, that the self is regulating, or even worse, the self is being regulated, that's very misleading. Let alone the debate whether there is such a thing as self, or whether people are actually like rivers, they're in flux, displaying at given times, displaying different facets known as self-states. We'll leave that aside. I have a whole playlist dedicated to it, the IPAM playlist. Okay, so we equated self-regulation with self-control, the ability to be in command of one's behavior, overt behavior, covert behavior, emotionally associated behaviors, or physical behaviors. The ability to restrain and to inhibit one's impulses. We'll discuss impulses in a minute. In some circumstances, there's a short-term gain, but there is a longer-term greater gain or longer-term adverse consequences. So if you can't control your impulses, you're likely to plunge into the short-term gain, regardless of the fact that you are foregoing the greater gain in the future, and or regardless of the fact that there are going to be untoward adverse consequences to your actions. And this is the epitome and the crux and the gist of self-control. Self-control is the ability to opt for long-term outcomes that are desirable and to avoid long-term outcomes that are adverse, to be averse to adverse, undesirable long-term outcomes. So self-control involves aversion to certain outcomes and the desire or the craving of other outcomes. It's, as you can beginning to see, founded on the pleasure principle. It's very, very primitive. It's an urge. Self-control is actually an urge, and self-regulation is therefore, to a large degree, instinctual, actually, to use the lingo of psychoanalysis. The choice of short-term outcomes over longer-term prospects is known as impulsiveness. Of course, you can't do any of this if you don't have self-discipline. Self-discipline is the control of one's impulses and desires, foregoing immediate satisfaction, delaying gratification, we'll discuss it a bit later, and favoring longer-term desirable goals. There is consequently a resolute adherence to a regimen or course of action in order to achieve these goals. We could therefore say that all these complex, self-regulation and so on and so forth, self-control, self-command, self-discipline, all this complex is about goal attainment. It's goal-oriented. This is very ironic because it would mean that psychopaths have an extremely elevated level of self-regulation, self-discipline. because psychopaths are goal-oriented. But of course, this would not be true, because what psychopaths regard as goals are usually short-term ones. So psychopaths have a preference for short-term impulsive goals. And in this sense, they end up self-defeating or self-destructing. So while on the face of it, superficially, psychopaths are goal-oriented and therefore more self-regulated, they're actually less self-regulated because their preference is opposed, is the mirror image of the preference of healthy people. Healthy people prefer long-term goals, and healthy people are averse to adverse outcomes. They prefer desirable outcomes. All this is mediated via what we call impulses. Impulse is a sudden, compelling urge to act. Now, some impulses result in action without deliberation, and this is known as impulsion. Um, and uh, in some cases, there is what is known as impulse control disorder. Impulse control disorder is a disorder characterized by a failure to resist impulses, drives, or temptations, um, a compulsion to commit acts that are harmful to oneself and to others. So, an impulse control disorder is an element or ingredient in other mental health issues, other disorders that may involve problems of impulse control. For example, substance use disorders, paraphilias, sexual disorders, conduct disorders, and mood disorders. So, yeah, impulses can go awry because they're very, very overwhelmingly strong. They flood the zone. You're flooded with it. You want it now. And so it's very primitive, very reptile, if you wish, very, very basic, very animalistic. In psychoanalytic theory, an impulse is the expression of psychic energy from instinctual drives, such as sex and hunger. And I think rightly so, although this definition is way too limited, because we have impulses not related to sex and hunger. For example, the impulse to power. But coming back to impulses in general, impulse control is when you're able to resist the impulse. There's a desire, there's a temptation, there's an opportunity. You may even believe rationally, analytically, you may believe that there will be no negative outcomes should you succumb to the impulse, but you still resist it because, for example, it's socially condemned, socially unacceptable, or because you don't want to harm other people. So when you resist an impulse, when you regulate the translation of impulse into action, that is impulse control. And impulse control, as I said, can be impaired in impulse control disorder. But impulse control involves what we call delayed gratification or delay of gratification. It's when when you give up on an immediate reward in order to obtain a larger, more desired, or more pleasurable reward in the future. But this is only one category, as I mentioned before. The other category is when you let go of an impulse, when you do not allow the impulse to translate into action because you're simply afraid of the consequences. And of course, in impulse control disorders, there's immediate gratification, the experience of satisfaction or receipt of reward as soon as a response is made. So your actions are immediately gratified. And this is very addictive and intoxicating, and because it is founded on what Freud called the pleasure principle. It was part of the pleasure pain principle. The pleasure principle is a view that human beings are governed by the desire for gratification. They crave pleasure, the discharge of tension that builds up, the cumulative tension and stress and anxiety that build up are experienced as pain, unpleasure. And so, as long as you don't discharge this, as long as you don't experience the opposite, as long as you don't experience pleasure, this unpleasure will continue to accumulate like some kind of toxic waste, and poison you, ultimately. In classical psychoanalytical theory, Sigmund Freud's work, the pleasure principle is the psychic force that motivates people to seek immediate gratification of instinctual, libidinal impulses. I think today we would call it the dopaminergic system. Today there is a neuroscientific grounding to the pleasure principle, in effect. And so Freud said that sex, hunger, thirst, elimination, going to the toilet, they're all instincts that have to be immediately gratified. But I think he minimized the range and repertory of impulses and drives. For example, I think power, they need to be powerful, to be in control, to be a master. I think that's absolutely equal to sex or to. And so in the trilateral model of Freud, the pleasure principle dominated or controlled the id. The id operates most strongly during childhood because the ego and superego is a part of the ego. The ego-superego complex take time to develop. The id is mostly dominant during childhood, and you see children have problems with delayed gratification, the famous marshmallow experiment. They have problem with delayed gratification, and they seek immediate gratification. Later in adulthood, there's a reality principle. The ego embodies it, and ego mediates reality. We'll not go into all of this. So all this is a kind of not so much regulation. I think the word maybe was wrongly true. I mean, it's a wrong choice of word, I think. Maybe more appropriate to call it self-management. Self-management is when you control your behavior, especially when your behavior is in the pursuit of a particular object. You want to lose weight, you want to have sex with someone, you want to make money. So at that point, the impulses and urges could drive you to misbehave, could put you in a place of danger and risk. And so it's absolutely critical to control your behaviors. You can't control, in reality, you can't control impulses and urges and instincts and drives, whatever you want to call them. You can't control them. Even according to Freud, they are biological. You can't control them, but you can control the translation into action via inhibitory mechanisms, the process of socialization, and so on and so forth, internalizing role models, modeling, social values, and so on. There are various filters and membranes that make it very difficult to translate an impulse into action without the mediation of these layers of meaning and significance and rules, rule-based systems, and so on. So self-management is a desirable aspect for the individual, personally and socially. But self-management can go too far. It could become rigid. It could become sadistic. It could involve what we call the harsh inner critic, or more precisely, a bad internalized object. It could take over the individual. It could inhibit the individual to the point of life constriction or life rejection. And perhaps it's just another way, another metaphor, for example, for schizoid personality disorder. And so in behavior therapy nowadays, we train clients to apply techniques that help them to modify an undesirable behavior, for example, smoking, excessive eating, aggression, externalized aggression, aggressive outbursts, and so on. They learn to pinpoint the problem, they set realistic goals for changing, and they use various contingencies to establish and maintain a desired behavior and to monitor progress and so on and so forth. And in this sense, they create a regulatory system. Now, in my videos and of course in the literature, there's a lot of discussion of emotion dysregulation. Emotion dysregulation is a critical aspect of borderline personality disorder and borderline personality organization. I've also dealt a lot with external regulation. When all these functions that I've mentioned, the management system, has to be outsourced because the inner resources are either insufficient or they're compromised or they never came into being because of disruption for example, in the formation of the self in early childhood. So this video that I've made today is a general introduction to regulation. And then now go and watch the other videos on external regulation and dysregulation, and you will get the full picture. Regards from Paris.